Yeah, there's three strands that I track. And you could probably trace more, but I'm looking for things that I can actually put dates to on the
Okay.
timeline, not kind of generic, larger and broader concepts of history, but actually timelines I could trace, right? So, for example, you can trace the timeline of spirituality in the ways that mythologies are embraced by ancient cultures. You can kind of get rough starting time for each of these mythologies, a rough ending time for each of these mythologies. And what you'll see is, if you read those mythologies, is that
Mhm.
they all have some broad similarities, broad brush similarities, because the expectations of all of us as humans are pretty consistent over time when we start to think and imagine what God would be like. C.S.
Mhm.
Lewis describes these as the kinds of man's myths from the minds of
Hmm.
poets and thinkers, given what
Mhm.
evidence is available to them. Now, he uses the word myth not to mean a falsehood or a lie or a tall tale. He means it as a description of deity or a description of how deity
Mhm.
might enter into the world, how we get here, how God works in the world. These types of mythologies,
Yeah.
he would describe man's mythologies. So I actually read all of those and I discovered about 15. You could probably stretch it to 18 or reduce it to 10, but about 15 that I saw repeatedly in the mythologies, and each ancient mythology would contain some combination, not always the same ones, of either 6 to 10 of these 15 broader expectations of humans. But it turns out that when Jesus arrives in the first century, he meets and actually possesses all 15 of the attributes, even though the ancients don't, no one gets more than 10. So what's interesting about that is that Jesus seems to meet not just the prophecies of the Jews, that's another strand in the fuse, but he meets the expectations of what we would call pagans or non-Jews or
Mhm.
non-Christians, right? People
Mhm.
who believe in a God other than Yahweh. Well, they have expectations of God too. And Jesus actually most robustly meets those expectations. So this kind of old claim we've heard for years now that Jesus is a copycat savior, well, in
Mhm.
some sense, you might be able to say he's definitely, in a broad sense. So, for example, one of the most common iterations or imaginations of ancients about their gods is that they are going to enter into the world in a supernatural way, an unexpected, extra natural way. Okay, well, that's different depending on the god. Sometimes he emerges out of the side of a mountain, sometimes out of the thigh of another god. Sometimes, there's lots of different crazy ways.
Mhm.
Well, it turns out that Jesus also enters the world in an unexpected supernatural way. But wouldn't you expect that if there's a supernatural God, he would probably both enter and exit his realm supernaturally? I think that's a common expectation that we would all have. Well, Jesus meets those broad expectations, even if he does not meet them identically.
Mhm.
And this is why to argue that somehow the first century writers trying to convince a Jewish audience of the messiahship of Jesus of Nazareth would somehow steal and cobble together all of the ancient expectations of pagans, I think is a bit of a stretch.
Yeah.
On the
Yeah.
other hand, it just makes sense that if God wants to enter into his creation, at that moment when the most worshiping people have the most common expectations of God, well, now you've got a narrower window of opportunity,
Mhm.
because these things, some of them stop being worshipped earlier than other times in history. But it turns out Jesus falls right about in the middle of when all these mythologies, the most number of mythologies, are still actively being worshipped with certain expectations that Jesus happens to meet most robustly. So there is a timing about his arrival. I always say that if you want, when the expected meets the expectations of the expector, you get better results. This is true for everything. This is true in your marriage too, by the way. This is true in every aspect of life. But it certainly could be true also of God, is that Jesus meets the most active expectations of the ancients who are thinking hard about God. And this is
Mhm.
why Paul says this, I think, on Mars Hill in Acts 17.
Mhm.
You people are really religious. Like, you have a lot of ideas about God. I'm here to show you where you're right and where you're wrong.
Mhm.
And that's what I think you see happening with that's one of those fuses. The other third fuse I talk about in the book is the kind of cultural empire changing fuse as one empire rises and falls, leading up to the Roman Empire, which has this unifying ability and provides several key aspects of culture that favor the communication of anything that occurs in the first century of note.
Hmm.
You'll have roads in place. You'll have postal services in place. You'll have
Hmm.
transportation devices in place. You'll have a 200-year period of peace. You'll have a certain amount of religious tolerance that at least allows for the initiation of any structure to start. So there's some things that are in place from the perspective of culture that also give you a window of opportunity during the Pax Romana, that 200-year period of peace, which, by the way, helped because the roads that Paul was walking on to express the truth about Jesus were not available to him 200 years earlier. Before their 200-year period of peace allowed the Roman Empire to shift its resources from war games, from pursuing wars, to creating the infrastructure for which they could prepare for the next war, which meant roads that didn't turn too sharply because you have to move these war machines. So that's why more bridges and tunnels are built in a Roman Empire than in other, because they're moving armies without sharp turns. Well, those kinds of roads, that expression, all roads lead to Rome, was for the most part happening during this period of time. And guess what that favored? It favored the transportation of ideas as well as mail and armies. And so the idea called Christianity has legs now in which you can walk. And that's what happens in that first century.
Wow. Yeah, in the missionary community, I used to be a missionary, and we would talk about what, God has put eternity in their hearts, as we say. And that's just what you're talking about. And some of these pagan mythologies and parallels, there's so much parallelomania that goes on. It's like in a very broad way, maybe, but there's no way that the stories of these other pagan deities was copied to make Jesus' story. Paganism would not make Christianity more interesting or fun for Jewish people.
Exactly. But can you imagine then that the characteristics described by Matthew to a largely Jewish audience? Who uses more prophecy than Matthew in trying to make his case to his audience? And that's the audience that you expect then. I'm going to cobble together. You should recognize stories from Attis and from Heracles. And really, now it turns out many of these systems actually ended up bending and shaping themselves after Jesus in the first, second, third, fourth century before they vanished off the map. So like Attis and Heracles and Mithras, many of these that no longer are being worshipped do adapt in some way. They are either modified, merged, or mention Jesus in some way. And that's part of the fallout we see. The fallout even affects other non-Christian religious worldviews. So I think that, and again, and in the end, we have to ask ourselves, if you were to overlap, I do this in one of the chapters of the book. And I think when I first did this as a new investigator of these notions, like 25 years ago, when I first became a Christian, I always say I would have had people ask me, so which did you do first? I wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity. That looks at everything in the New Testament. This book does just the opposite. It looks at everything outside the New Testament. So the question is, people ask, well, so which one of these did you do first? Well, to be honest, it was a terribly confusing and messy period of my life in which this is true of all investigations, by the way. You might think, okay, I'm on my path. I've got a timeline. And then someone calls and says, hey, so-and-so is in town. And they say they saw this thing over here. So now suddenly you've got a time-sensitive witness. You're going to stop everything, rabbit trail that for 2 weeks, work all those leads that are developed in 2 weeks. Then you come back to your case. Well, that was kind of me 25 years ago, looking at I would discover something and I would go, and I would spend, a week. And I will tell you, and Susie will tell you too, that I spent hours. I was working on what was called a 410. It's more like, but in those days I was working undercover. So it was probably maybe like about 416, 16-hour shifts, but we were working them only 4 days a week. So I had 3 days off every week. So I get up early morning every day, and before I go to work, I would be reading. I would sleep no more than 6 hours. I would never allow myself to sleep more than 6 hours because I wanted to study the case. Then I would get in a surveillance situation where I had time sometimes in my unit to just sit and read. And I had all these books. People thought I was crazy. My partners, I got an email last week from somebody who wrote to me to say, hey, I remember when you used to make fun of anything Jesus. And I kind of wonder if God already had kind of set you aside for this work, because this is now, he's talking about 25 years ago. He knew me then, and he was one of my training officers. And he remembered as a trainee how I was anti-Jesus. And I'm surprised. I don't remember ever saying that out loud at that point in my career, but he remembered it. So they saw this chance for transformation. And so for me, I was doing this work. And back then I was identifying, wow, there's like a window of opportunity here in the first century
Hmm.
But I had what I would have called a blogger's sense of that. In other words, I'd find it in the book, but I kind of write it down on notes. I couldn't remember where I found it in the book then after that, right? Like, it wasn't sourced. I just remember having read it, and I would kind of cobble this case together.
Uh-huh.
But now writing this book, I knew I had to actually source these things. So I had to figure out, which book did I get that from originally? What's the source I used way back then?
Uh-huh.
And of course, things have been updated a lot since then. So now, as you see in that one chapter on the red zone, that area of opportunity in
Hmm.
which all three fuses overlap,
Hmm.
that's an area of about 100 years, 29 BC to about 70 AD, the destruction of the temple. It's in that range that all three of these fuses have a common window of opportunity. And it turns out that Jesus arrives right in the middle 30 years. The middle 33 years are his. And I thought that was kind of interesting that he would
Mm.
happen to arrive at the fullness of time,
Yeah.
just when all of those fuses have burned and provided an opportunity.